Hello guys, and welcome back to another video. Today, I've got this little AMD Radeon RX 550 low profile graphics card that I'll be testing. I picked this up for $40 used on eBay, and it's supposed to be a somewhat capable budget card, but I'm gonna test that. Let's get started. To test this card, I've chosen a relatively suitable test bed for such an old and lower powered card. The Optiplex 7020 SFF with an i5 4590 and 16GB of DDR3 RAM. For today's testing purposes, I'll slot in my own already imaged 128GB SSD, and I'll use an external games SSD for simplicity's sake as I plan to sell this computer at some point. This specific 7020 is actually one that I believe was featured in my video about the $35 Optiplex that didn't post. In that video, I paid $35 up front for the broken Optiplex, $15 for a new motherboard, $6 in DDR3 RAM, and about $15 on a 256GB SATA SSD. That brings the system, with the RX 550, to about $110. The part of this budget build that separates it from some of the others that you can find online is that this one is done without much savvy shopping at all.
A little bit boom or bust, with nothing on the market for months at a time.
Which is an important take to keep in mind for budget builders. Some people don't have the time to check Marketplace, OfferUp, Craigslist, and eBay every day for weeks or even months to snag the deal needed to replicate some of those builds. Additionally, some people might just want, or even need, the computer right now. Could you do better than this with about $110 to $120? Absolutely. Is this an option that might appeal to some people? Also, absolutely. Which is why today I've decided to put it together and run a few tests on it just to see how capable this configuration can really be. With the card confirmed working and its respective drivers installed, there was one last thing that I was going to do before running any tests on this system. Since this card is old, it's a good idea to do a quick repaste on it to ensure that the temps it'll run at are as acceptable as possible. Although, it is worth noting that due to the smaller cooler on this card, I wouldn't expect it to run very cool at all. With the repaste done, and don't mention the excessive thermal paste, it's direct dye, so I want to ensure that every square millimeter of the die is covered. It's finally time to slot the card back into the system and start testing both some synthetic benchmarks as well as some real gaming benchmarks. While installing some games, I noticed what I believe was a CPU bottleneck. Notice that there's one core almost at max utilization while downloading. It limited the downloads to about 200 megabits per second, about 25 megabytes per second. This isn't egregious and might be faster than a lot of people's internet connections, but it is worth keeping in mind if you are hoping to download your games at your internet connection's full gigabit bandwidth or anything like that. Now it's time for some benchmarks. I originally had a much smaller suite of tests, but decided to record a few more just now, so there's 2 synthetic benchmarks as well as 5 games. I wanted to include CSGO in this test, but MSI Afterburner wouldn't latch onto the game for whatever reason, and I did not feel like spending my time trying to fix that. But you can take my word when I say it's definitely playable on this system. In this test suite, these are the programs I chose to include. Cinebench R23 for the people who want to know how the CPU performs, 3D Mark Time Spy for an overall score, Forza Horizon 4, Forza Horizon 5, I'll explain why 2 Forza games in a second, Halo Infinite, Spider-Man Remastered, and Satisfactory. Starting off with both of the synthetic benchmarks, in Cinebench R23 the system scored a multi-core score of about 3100 points with a regular Windows 10 install that has a few applications running in the background. For 3D Mark Time Spy, the system scored an overall score of 1313 points, with a CPU score of 3012 and a GPU score of 1195. Now, synthetic benchmarks are great for getting an objective score or analysis on a system so that it can be compared against other systems, but translating a 3D Mark score or a Cinebench score into actual performance numbers in games is practically impossible. So, now I'll cover the gaming tests that I ran on this system. Starting out with the first game that I ran here, Forza Horizon 4. I originally was only going to have Horizon 4, but the performance this system offered in it somewhat blew me away. At 1080p native, medium preset, the system managed to push out an average frame rate of 46.4 FPS, with a 1% low of 36 FPS and a 0.1% low of 7.5. So, a little stuttery at times, but during most of the benchmark it ran smoothly and was completely playable. If you're trying to hit the 60 FPS target, however, you can easily achieve that with the low preset. Next, I moved on to the other game that was in my original test suite, Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered. This is quite a new title, being released in August of 2022. With the fact that it's a recent title, it's highly taxing on your GPU, so I wanted to see how the 550 would handle it. Running 1080p native at the low preset, an average of 33.7 FPS isn't exactly amazing for a faster action game such as this one. The lows are alright, with a 19.6 FPS 1% low and a 10.2 FPS 0.1% low. For a system with a 9-year-old CPU and 6-year-old GPU though, running a title that's barely a year old with the speed at which technology advances, it's still decently impressive. However, since I don't love the lower frame rate that this card offered in this specific title and wanted to see if it could get any faster, I decided to pull out the one trick this card still has up its sleeve: AMD's Fidelity Super Resolution. With FSR set to balanced and the same settings as before, other than of course it not being 1080p native anymore, we got an average of 38.1 FPS. Still, not great, but when you're dealing with such low frame rates anyway, these smaller differences are genuinely noticeable. Also, the 1% and 0.1% lows went from 19.6 FPS to 24.6, and from 10.2 to 15.5 FPS respectively. With the card's surprisingly decent showing in Forza Horizon 4, I chose to move up a generation to Forza Horizon 5 to see how it would stack up against this title. The results were slightly less impressive than I was hoping for, with a 29.1 FPS average at 1080p medium settings. But there was still hope to get an alright experience in Horizon 5 with this card: low settings. Switching to low settings granted an extra 9.3 FPS, totaling to an average of 38.4, which felt immensely better and even quite playable. Percent lows were 29.1 FPS for the 1% low and 4.1 FPS for the 0.1% low, although that was almost certainly taken from a singular stutter that didn't happen multiple times during the testing, so take the 0.1% here with a grain of salt. Next was a AAA title that I've played a ton of and have gotten quite competitive in: Halo Infinite. This game is quite the beast, so I went into these tests with low expectations and I'm glad I did. At 1080p native with the low preset, the poor little RX 550 was trying its hardest but only managed to muster up 33.4 FPS with a 1% low of 27.1 and a 0.1% low of 22.3 in an arena multiplayer match. This is, however, technically playable, and one could almost certainly have fun in this game with this card, especially if you're alright with turning down the render resolution a bit. That's great and all, but the thing with Halo Infinite is that the multiplayer and the campaign are two entirely different beasts for a system to run. The campaign is generally a much heavier load on the system, and this proved to be true once more with this test. In order to get a playable frame rate, I had to turn the render scale down to 75% to get 33.9 FPS average with low settings. The game didn't look quite its finest, that's for certain, but I ended up getting into the game a bit and spent a good several minutes playing through a portion of the campaign, which is a good sign for this little system. Oh, and the 1% low was 28.4 FPS with a 0.1% low of 2.8. Finally, it's time for the last game on my little test suite here, Satisfactory. A lot of you all probably haven't heard of this game and almost certainly don't play it, but it's one of my favorite games and I'd highly recommend it. When you end up with a bigger factory, it becomes more CPU intensive. However, my test factory is a moderately small one to simulate a common-ish load tier for this card. It managed 37.6 FPS at 1080p native with low settings, and a 1% low of 13.9 with a 0.1% low of 2.4. Although, do keep in mind that Satisfactory in general can just be a bit of a stuttery game, so I wouldn't blame the card too much for these lows. Alright, those are all the tests that I ran on this little system. Now let's talk about my conclusion and thoughts of it. I think that if you're someone on a relatively tight budget who needs a computer right now or just can't wait around and spend the time deal hunting to get the absolute best parts that you can for this money, it's a pretty good option. Could you do way better with the same or even less money if you're willing to put in the time and effort to scour the internet for the right deals to pop up? Oh, absolutely. I'll never disagree with that. But the thing that makes the system and this configuration somewhat special is that you can go on eBay after watching this video and within a couple minutes have a shopping cart full of what you need to make this system for this price. The fact that this configuration is available right now at this price pretty much all the time is what sets it apart. There are probably better options for readily available configurations with this budget too, of course. If you're going to consider making one of these computers, definitely do a good bit of research first so that you can stretch your dollar as far as possible while not having to put in tons of work to deal hunt. Whatever you think about this configuration and the advantages and disadvantages of it, I hope that you were able to at least enjoy this video, and maybe even learn a thing or two. I hope to see you all next time. Goodbye.